In Institutes Profound, Calvin's voice did ring. 12 points he made, God's truth to unveil, each verse a gem, its meaning clear to bring, theology's depth in each line unveiled. In Psalms we find the fool who dares declare there is no God, a dark and foolish plea, yet deep within they cannot fully bear the truth of God's existence they still see. For those who stifle nature's guiding light, in willful ignorance their minds they bind, they struggle, yet in stubbornness they fight, denying God's existence in their mind. The wicked, hardened in their sinful course, banish remembrance of their God with glee, but from within a sense remains, of course, a spark of truth they fail to fully see. In madness they deny God's very being, though essence they retain, his justice they defy. They paint God idle in the heavens seen, yet doing nothing as the wicked lie. To cast off God's governance, a great mistake, leaving all to chance and evil's dark advance. God's nature cries for justice's sweet sake, his providence assures a righteous defense. Those who secure extinguish God's dread flame, they deny God's presence in their heart's disdain. In folly they deny his holy name, while God in truth remains forever the same. Divine judgment falls on those with hearts grown dull. They close their eyes to righteousness and grace. In spiritual blindness they live not full, for God's truth they willingly erase. The wicked lack reverence, fear of God's might, their hearts devoid of God's guiding light. Their souls grow dim in spiritual night, yet occasional judgment brings truth to light. They say in their hearts God's face he hides away, forgets our deeds, our sins remain concealed. But God's omnipotent in judgment's ray reveals their actions, all will be revealed. They may acknowledge God of form and mind, yet fashion idols lifeless, mute, and frail. Denying God's true power, they remain blind. Their false creations in their hearts they hail. Though struggling with convictions, they may try to banish God, their minds in stupefaction. Divine judgment, like a whisper in the sky, will reach them, calling for their soul's reaction. In brutish oblivion they often dwell, their hearts like beasts in ignorance they roam. Though God confronts their minds in darkness swell, yet in his truth they may one day find a home. In Calvin's Institutes, this truth is penned, 12 verses deep, the human soul's great quest to find God's grace, his judgment in the end, and in his presence find it. Welcome back to my Fortress of Theology. I'm Jonathan the Cage Stage Crusader, and I'm on a pilgrimage through the Institutes of the Christian Religion. Today I'm working my way through Book 1, Chapter 4, Section 2. If you like this stuff, subscribe, like, comment, share, say a prayer for me, help boost the algorithm and all that. Now let's get into this. John Calvin writes, the expression of David, Psalm 14:1 and 53:1, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God, is primarily applied to those who, as will shortly farther appear, stifle the light of nature and intentionally stupefy themselves. We see many, after they have become hardened in a daring course of sin, madly banishing all remembrance of God though spontaneously suggested to them from within by natural sense. To show how detestable this madness is, the psalmist introduces them as distinctly denying that there is a God, because although they do not disown his essence, they rob him of his justice and providence and represent him as sitting idly in heaven, nothing being less accordant with the nature of God than to cast off the government of the world, leaving it to chance, and so to wink at the crimes of men that they may wanton with impunity in evil courses. It follows that every man who indulges in security, after extinguishing all fear of divine judgment, virtually denies that there is a God. As a just punishment of the wicked, after they have closed their own eyes, God makes their hearts dull and heavy, and hence seeing they see not. David, indeed, is the best interpreter of his own meaning when he says elsewhere, the wicked has no fear of God before his eyes, Psalm 36:1. And again, he has said in his heart, God is forgotten, he hideth his face, he will never see it. Thus, although they are forced to acknowledge that there is some God, they, however, rob him of his glory by denying his power. For as Paul declares, if we believe not, he abideth faithful, he cannot deny himself. 2 Timothy 2:13. So those who feign to themselves a dead and dumb idol are truly said to deny God. It is, moreover, to be observed that though they struggle with their own convictions, and would fain not only banish God from their minds, but from heaven also, their stupefaction is never so complete as to secure them from being occasionally dragged before the divine tribunal. Still, as no fear restrains them from rushing violently in the face of God, so long as they are hurried on by that blind impulse, it cannot be denied that their prevailing state of mind in regard to him is brutish oblivion. So, in this section from John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, Calvin discusses the idea that some individuals, whom he describes as fools, deny the existence of God, not by outright disbelief, but by stifling their awareness of him. These individuals intentionally dull their sense of understanding of God's existence and providence, allowing them to indulge in sinful behavior without fear of divine judgment. Although they do not disown the concept of God entirely, they strip God of his attributes, portraying him as inactive in the world. Calvin argues that such a denial of God's active role in the world is a form of practical atheism. Even though these individuals may acknowledge the concept of God, he also points out that God's punishment for their willful ignorance is a further hardening of their hearts and spiritual blindness. This section highlights the danger of deliberately ignoring God's presence in moral governance, leading to a state of spiritual oblivion. Calvin suggests that while these individuals may occasionally confront the reality of God, their prevailing attitude is one of disregard and indifference, akin to a brutish oblivion regarding divine matters. Well, let's break this down even further and see how deep this goes. You can see that Calvin makes 12 points here. One, the quote begins with a reference to Psalm 14:1 and 53:1, in which David states, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." Second point, this expression primarily applies to those who stifle the light of nature and intentionally stupefy themselves regarding the existence of God. Three, many individuals, after becoming hardened in sin, purposely banish any remembrance of God, even though the natural sense of God's existence is suggested to them from within. Four, the psalmist condemns this madness by depicting such individuals as denying the existence of God. However, they don't disown God's essence, but rather rob him of his justice and providence, portraying him as idle in heaven. Fifth, this is emphasized that nothing is less accordant with God's nature than casting off the governance of the world, leaving it to chance and allowing people to indulge in evil without consequence. Six, those who indulge in security after extinguishing all fear of divine judgment are effectively denying the existence of God. Seven, God punishes the wicked by making their hearts dull and heavy, causing them to close their own eyes, which results in their inability to see spiritually. Eight, David's words, "The wicked have no fear of God before his eyes," are referenced to highlight the lack of reverence for God among the wicked. Nine, the wicked are described as saying in their hearts that God has forgotten, hidden his face, and will never see their actions. 10, even though they are forced to acknowledge some form of God, they effectively deny his power by creating a lifeless and mute idol in their minds. 11, the quote emphasizes that even though they struggle with their convictions and attempt to banish God entirely, their stupefaction does not prevent them from occasionally facing divine judgment. And 12, despite occasional confrontations with God's reality, their prevailing state of mind regarding him is described as a brutish oblivion. So let's break each one down with point one. The section begins with a reference to Psalm 14:1 and 53:1, where David says, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." These verses from the Psalms are pivotal in understanding Calvin's theological perspective on the denial of God's existence. In both Psalms, King David uses identical language to describe the mindset of the wicked. It's important to note that the term fool here does not necessarily refer to someone who intellectually denies God's existence in a philosophical sense. Instead, it carries a broader connotation. It signifies that those who live as though God does not exist, practically denying him through their sinful behavior and refusal to acknowledge his authority and moral governance. Calvin provides insightful commentary on these verses. He distinguishes between two forms of atheism: explicit atheism, where individuals openly and intellectually deny God's existence, and practical atheism, which concerns those who, although acknowledging God with their lips, deny him through their actions and attitudes. Calvin argues that the fool mentioned by David falls into the latter category. These individuals may affirm God's existence, but effectively live as if God is irrelevant to their lives, disregarding his moral laws and divine providence. Further elucidate Calvin's point, we can draw upon real world examples where individuals may not explicitly deny God, but practically deny him through their behaviors. Moral atheism. Some people may indeed acknowledge God's existence, but live in ways that blatantly disregard his moral principles. For instance, a person who habitually cheats, lies, and harms others without remorse or accountability is, according to Calvin's perspective, acting as if there is no God, whom they are morally answerable. The materialistic worldview. Others might adhere to a materialistic worldview that prioritizes material possessions, wealth, and success above all else. While not necessarily denying God's existence, their actions and priorities imply that they are living as though God's providence and moral standards have little or no significance in their lives. Indifference to spiritual matters. Some individuals may not actively reject God, but show apathy or indifference towards spiritual matters. They might rarely engage in prayer, reflection, or acts of worship, effectively living as if God has no substantial role in their daily existence. Calvin's point underscores a profound theological idea. Acknowledging God's existence verbally is insufficient in the realm of true faith. Authentic faith should manifest in actions and attitudes that align with the recognition of God's moral governance and providence. By referencing the Psalms, Calvin highlights the peril of living in a manner that practically denies God, even while one may verbally profess belief in him. This practical atheism, marked by disobedience or disregard for God's moral standards, is what David condemns in his Psalms, and it's what Calvin critiques in his theological works. In essence, Calvin calls for a faith that is lived out in every aspect of life, not just acknowledged intellectually or in words. In the second point that Calvin makes, the expression primarily applies to those who stifle the light of nature and intentionally stupefy themselves regarding the existence of God. In this context, Calvin is referring to the innate knowledge or awareness of God that, according to Christian theology, is present within every human being. He argues that the expression from Psalms applies particularly to those who actively suppress or ignore this natural knowledge. This suppression could occur for various reasons, such as a desire to pursue a sinful lifestyle without moral accountability. Calvin suggests that some individuals deliberately choose to make themselves spiritually ignorant. They engage in behaviors or adopt worldviews that lead them away from acknowledging God's existence or his moral governance. This intentional stupefaction may involve intellectual rejection of God's existence or a willful disregard of the evidence pointing to him. This point emphasizes the culpability of those who choose to remain ignorant of God. He contends that while God's existence is evident in the natural world, some people go to great lengths to suppress this knowledge, effectively shutting themselves off from recognizing God. Calvin often underscores the idea that this suppression is not due to a lack of evidence, but rather a deliberate act of rebellion against God's authority. We can further support Calvin's point with reference to additional passages in the Bible. Romans 1:18 through 21. In this passage, the Apostle Paul speaks of God's wrath against ungodliness and unrighteousness. He asserts that God's invisible attributes, such as his eternal power and divine nature, are clearly perceived in the natural world, leaving people without excuse when they suppress this knowledge. Paul describes the outcome of suppressing the knowledge of God. He states that those who did not honor or give thanks to God became futile in their thinking, and their hearts were darkened. Further illustrate Calvin's point by using some real world examples, such as atheistic philosophies. Certain atheistic or secular philosophies and worldviews actively promote the idea that there is no God. Followers of such philosophies may intentionally ignore or dismiss the evidence of God's existence present in creation, as Paul described in Romans 1:18 through 20. Then there's moral relativism. Some individuals may adopt a moral relativistic perspective that rejects the concept of objective moral standards. This rejection allows them to engage in behavior that goes against their innate moral sense, effectively suppressing what their natural awareness of God's moral laws as their natural awareness of God's moral laws as described in Romans 1:21. Or again, willful ignorance. In some cases, individuals may be exposed to compelling evidence for God's existence through science, philosophy, and personal experiences. Still, they choose to ignore or discredit this evidence due to personal biases or desire to maintain their current worldview. Calvin's second point, supplemented by additional biblical references, underscores the idea that the denial of God's existence is not always a result of honest intellectual inquiry, but can be a deliberate choice to suppress the innate knowledge of God present in all humans. This suppression, according to Calvin, stems from a desire to avoid moral accountability and continue in a life disconnected from God's moral governance. It serves as a reminder of the theological concept that humanity is held responsible for its response to the revelation of God in both nature and conscience. On to point three, many individuals, after becoming hardened in sin, purposely banish any remembrance of God, even though the natural sense of God's existence is suggested to them from within. And look who we have here. Elastica Thaumaturgus the Fourth, the princess of heretic hunters, the cutest of the pretty kitties. You're pawing at things again. You want attention. Yes, you do. You want attention. And the only way to get attention is for the people watching to subscribe and like and comment and share. For kitty's sake. She needs attention. You have to do it. Subscribe. Do it. Do it for the kitty. Come for the theology. Stay for the cute little pretty kitty. Yeah. Look how cute she is. Hmm? Look how cute she is. Yeah. There. Have you had enough attention? Hmm? Hmm? Where was that? Point three. Many individuals, after becoming hardened in sin, purposefully banish any remembrance of God, even though the natural sense of God's existence is suggested to them from within. Calvin begins by acknowledging that some individuals reach a state of being hardened in sin. This means they have persistently engaged in sinful behavior to the point where their hearts and consciences have become calloused, making them less responsive to moral and spiritual influences. You still pawing at things again? Hmm? Yeah, run off me. No treats for you tonight. Uh, Calvin begins by acknowledging that some individuals reach a state of being hardened in sin. This means they have persistently engaged in sinful behavior to the point where their hearts and consciences have become calloused, making them less responsive to moral and spiritual influences. They purposely banish the remembrance of God. Despite the innate sense of God's existence that resides within all people, a concept Calvin refers to as the sensus divinitatis, referred to back in Book 1, Chapter 1. Those who have become hardened in sin actively choose to banish any remembrance of God from their thoughts and lives. They do this intentionally to free themselves from moral accountability and the conviction that God's presence brings. Calvin underscores that even when individuals have hardened themselves in sin, a natural sense of God's existence continues to be suggested to them from within. This suggests that every person possesses an inherent knowledge of God that cannot be completely eradicated. This point emphasizes the role of human volition in this process. Calvin argues that the hardening of one's heart and banishment of God's remembrance are acts of deliberate rebellion against God's moral authority. Calvin also maintains that this internal sense of God's existence remains active within individuals, even in their fallen state, as a testimony to God's presence and sovereignty. You can see this in other passages of the Bible, such as Ephesians 4:18. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to their hardness of heart. The Apostle Paul describes the spiritual condition of some individuals as being darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to their hardness of heart. This aligns with the idea of being hardened in sin. In Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the works of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. Paul speaks of the law written on the hearts of Gentiles, emphasizing that even those without the Mosaic law have a conscience that bears witness to moral truths. This relates to the notion of the natural sense of God's existence within all humans. In the Gospel of John, chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, this is the judgment. Light has come into the world, and people love the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to light, lest his work should be exposed. In that passage, Jesus speaks of people loving darkness rather than light because their works are evil. This reflects the idea that some individuals purposely banish remembrance of God to avoid exposure to divine scrutiny. Now let's consider some real world examples that align with this perspective. Persistent sin and apathy. Individuals who persist in sinful behavior over time may develop an apathetic attitude towards matters of faith and morality. They may actively avoid religious discussions or thoughts that might challenge their lifestyle. Or selective ignorance. Some people intentionally ignore or downplay their consciences' convictions when they engage in actions they know are morally wrong. This selective ignorance allows them to continue in sin without feeling the full weight of guilt. Avoidance of moral accountability. In certain cases, individuals who have become hardened in their sinful ways may distance themselves from religious or spiritual environments to avoid feeling convicted or held accountable for their actions. Calvin's third point underscores the concept that individuals, even when deeply entrenched in sinful behavior, possess an inherent knowledge of God within them. This knowledge can be suppressed and ignored, but it persists as a testimony to God's presence and moral governance. Calvin argues that such individuals actively choose to banish remembrance of God and maintain their sinful ways of life, making the deliberate choice to suppress their conscience's witness. This understanding aligns with the broader theological idea that humans bear moral responsibility for their choices and actions, including the hardening of their hearts in rebellion against God. On to point 4. The psalmist condemns this madness by depicting such individuals as denying the existence of God. However, they don't disown God's essence, but rather rob him of his justice and providence, portraying him as idol in heaven. Calvin begins acknowledging the psalmist, referring to King David in Psalms 14 and 53, condemns a particular kind of madness or folly in individuals. These individuals, as previously discussed, have intentionally banished remembrance of God and suppressed their innate sense of his existence. The psalmist depicts these individuals as denying the existence of God. This denial does not necessarily entail a complete rejection of God's essence or existence as in atheism, but rather a distortion of God's attributes. These individuals effectively disown God's role in governing the world and ensuring justice. Calvin's point is that these individuals strip God of his justice and providence. They portray God as indifferent or idle in heaven, detached from the affairs of the world. In their view, God does not actively oversee human actions or intervene to ensure justice is done. This point underscores the seriousness of portraying God as indifferent or idle. He argues that such a portrayal diminishes God's attributes and distorts his nature. In Calvin's theology, God is both just and actively providential, overseeing the world and ensuring that justice is ultimately served. To deny or distort these aspects of God's character is a grave error. Psalm 10, verse 4. In the pride of his face, the wicked does not seek him. All his thoughts are, there is no God. This aligns with the idea of individuals denying God's existence in practice. Romans 1, verses 21 through 23. In Romans, Paul speaks of people who exchange the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals. This reflects the distortion of God's essence as discussed by Calvin. Some examples of this mindset would be selective theism. Some individuals may profess a belief in God, but in practice live as if God is detached from the world's affairs. They might not expect divine justice or providence to intervene in human matters, effectively robbing God of these attributes in their worldview. Or idolatry. In some cultures, idolatry involves worshiping images or symbols rather than recognizing the true nature of God. This practice distorts the essence of God, similar to what Calvin describes. Apathy towards injustice. People who witness injustice in the world and do nothing may indirectly portray God as idle in the face of suffering, even if they profess belief in God's existence. Calvin's fourth point underscores the seriousness of distorting God's attributes, especially his justice and providence. To depict God as indifferent or idle in heaven is to undermine the core aspect of God's character. According to Calvin's theological framework, it reflects a form of practical atheism where individuals may not deny God's existence outright, but rob him of his essential qualities, which ultimately leads to a distorted understanding of God's role in the world. On the fifth point made by Calvin, it is emphasized that nothing is less accordant with God's nature than casting off the governance of the world, leaving it to chance and allowing people to indulge in evil without consequences. Calvin begins by underscoring the nature of God. In Christian theology, God is both sovereign and just. God's nature involves actively governing the world, ensuring that divine providence oversees human affairs, and upholding justice. The point emphasizes that it is entirely contrary to God's nature to abandon the governance of the world and to leave it to chance. Allowing people to indulge in evil without consequences goes against God's character as the ultimate source of moral order and justice. In Calvin's theological framework, God's providence ensures that there are consequences for human actions, including moral ones. To cast up this divine governance and allow evil to go unchecked contradicts the fundamental belief in God's active involvement in human affairs. This point centers on the theological understanding of God's providence and justice. He argues that God's governance and justice are integral to his nature and cannot be separated. Casting off this governance or leaving the world to chance implies a distortion of God's attributes and a misunderstanding of his role in the world. Proverbs 16:33. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. That proverb emphasizes God's providential control, even over seemingly random events. Back to Romans chapter 2, verse 6. Paul speaks of God, that he will render to each one according to his works, underscoring the principle of divine justice and accountability. Isaiah 46:10. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times. What is still to come, I say my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. This verse highlights God's sovereignty. In the world of human affairs, we can see various examples of this, such as in legal systems. In principle, legal systems exist so that there are consequences for unlawful actions. This reflects a human attempt to mirror the divine principle of justice, ensuring that individuals are held accountable for their actions. These days, however, especially here in Canada, where I am, the legal system is typically used to abuse those who stand against tyrants, while the truly criminal are left to victimize and cause chaos, which gives tyrants an excuse to implement even more draconian laws and oppress people. Natural disasters and chance. While natural disasters may appear to be random events, many religious believers see them as part of God's providential plan. They view seemingly chance occurrences as ultimately under God's control. So, from the Christian perspective, climate change is not happening due to human activity. And even if it is, God controls the weather. And as like A.W. Pink famously said, if you complain against the weather, you are murmuring against God. Social justice movements advocating for social justice, often pretend to align with the idea of accountability for systemic wrongdoing. They seek to address issues where individuals or institutions have allowed evil to persist without consequence. But the fact is, social justice is just a euphemism for cultural Marxism, and the people behind it do not care about justice. They seek to enslave and abuse through the destruction of all values and freedoms. Social justice activists never advocate for basic human rights, such as gun ownership, which protects all other human rights, nor do they advocate for freedom of speech and the free exchange of information. Rather, they push for censorship, which results in permission from the ruling party to speak, which is just basically a cunt hair length away from commands of what to think from the despots running the country. Calvin's fifth point underscores the core tenets of his theological perspective. In his view, God's nature includes active governance and justice. To cast off this divine governance or allow evil to go unchecked is a distortion of God's character. It also emphasizes the concept of divine providence, where God is intricately involved in the world's affairs, ensuring that there are consequences for human actions, both morally and otherwise. This understanding shapes Calvin's theology and informs his critique of allowing evil without accountability. The sixth point made by Calvin: those who indulge in security after extinguishing all fear of divine judgment are effectively denying the existence of God. Calvin begins by describing a particular attitude or behavior indulging in security. This refers to a state of complacency or carelessness where individuals no longer feel any fear or concern about divine judgment. They live as if they are immune to God's moral scrutiny. In this context, Calvin suggests that these individuals have deliberately extinguished or suppressed any fear of divine judgment. They no longer feel the weight of moral accountability before God, believing that their actions will have no consequences in the divine realm. This point asserts that by living in a state of security and dismissing the fear of divine judgment, individuals are effectively denying the existence of God. While they may not overtly reject God's existence intellectually, their actions and attitudes suggest a practical denial of God's presence in moral governance. This point emphasizes the relationship between fear of divine judgment and genuine acknowledgement of God's existence. He argues that true faith includes reverence for God's moral authority and accountability. To extinguish this fear and indulge in security implies a fundamental misunderstanding of God's role in human life. Proverbs 1, verse 7. This verse states, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." It underscores the idea that reverence for God is foundational to true knowledge and wisdom. Matthew 10:28. Jesus says, "And do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." This verse emphasizes the importance of fearing God's judgment. Psalm 36:1. Transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes. David speaks of the wicked of having no fear of God before his eyes, highlights the connection between the fear of God and moral conduct. Some real world examples that prove this point are moral accountability. Individuals who consistently engage in unethical or immoral behavior without remorse may effectively be living in a state of security, dismissing any fear of divine judgment. They act as if their actions have no moral consequences. Overconfidence and prosperity. People who experience material success or prosperity but disregard ethical considerations may indulge in security, thinking that their wealth insulates them from moral security or from moral scrutiny. Apathy towards spiritual matters. Some individuals may be apathetic or indifferent towards spiritual matters and moral reflection. They may live as if God's existence and moral accountability are inconsequential. Calvin's sixth point underscores the significance of fear and divine judgment. acknowledging God's existence. In this theological perspective, true faith involves a reverence for God's moral authority and accountability. To extinguish his fear and indulgence, security implies practical denial of God's presence in moral governance. This understanding informs Calvin's critique of individuals who live as if they are immune to divine judgment, even while professing belief in God's existence. And the kitty has returned to paw at things once more. Yeah, not allowed to paw at those cords or anything. No, that's what naughty kitties do. Naughty kitties don't get treats. Yeah, I think you're just showing up because you want people to subscribe and like and share. Yeah, yeah, you want to be the star, right? You want to be on camera. Yeah, because you want attention. 'Cause you're a little kitty who's cute and narcissistic and demands attention. Yeah. On to point 7. God punishes the wicked by making their hearts dull and heavy, causing them to close their own eyes, which results in their inability to see spiritually. Calvin begins by addressing the concept of divine punishment. In his theology, God is actively involved in the lives of individuals. He may choose to punish the wicked for their sinful behavior. Calvin describes a specific form of divine punishment, which involves God making the hearts of the wicked dull and heavy. This means that their hearts become spiritually insensitive and unresponsive to spiritual truths. As a result of his divine action, the wicked close their own eyes to spiritual realities. They become willfully blind to the truths of God and his moral standards, effectively choosing to remain in spiritual darkness. This point centers on the concept of divine hardening. He argues that while individuals have a degree of responsibility for their choices and actions, God may also play a role in hardening the hearts of the wicked as a form of divine judgment. This hardening results in spiritual blindness and inability to see or understand spiritual truths. Kitty, you behave. Yeah. Romans 1:24 through 25. In this passage, Paul speaks of God giving up or giving over individuals to the lusts of their hearts and to dishonorable passions as a form of divine judgment. This relates to the concept of divine punishment and spiritual blindness. Jesus says in Matthew 13, verses 13 through 15, This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in the case the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, You will indeed hear but never understand, and you will indeed see but never perceive. This people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. Jesus quotes Isaiah 6 in reference to those who hear but do not understand, emphasizing the concept of spiritual blindness as a consequence of rejecting God's message. And let's turn and consider some real world examples that align with Calvin's argument. Persistent rejection of the truth. Individuals who persistently reject spiritual or moral truths and actively engage in sinful behavior may experience a gradual hardening of their hearts, making them less receptive to spiritual guidance. Apathy towards faith. Some people may have grown up in a religious environment, but over time have become apathetic or indifferent to matters of faith. They may close their hearts and minds to religious teachings, effectively choosing spiritual blindness. Continued sinful behavior. Those who continue in a pattern of sinful behavior, knowingly violating moral principles, may experience a uh, spiritual numbness that hinders their ability to recognize or repent of their actions. Calvin's seventh point highlights the theological concept of divine punishment and divine hardening of the heart. It suggests that God may actively intervene in the lives of the wicked, making their hearts spiritually dull and causing them to close their own eyes to spiritual truths as a form of judgment. This concept aligns with Calvin's broader theological perspective on divine sovereignty and human responsibility. emphasizing the consequences of persistent disobedience and rebellion against God. Onward we proceed to point number 8, David's words. The wicked has no fear of God before his eyes, are a reference to highlight the lack of reverence for God among the wicked. Calvin begins by drawing attention to the concept of reverence for God, a central theme in his theology. Reverence for God implies a deep respect and awe for the divine, recognizing God's moral authority and the consequences of his judgment. The point references words from David, specifically, the wicked has no fear before his eyes. These words are taken from Psalm 36:1 and are used to illustrate the state of mind and heart of the wicked. The phrase no fear of God before his eyes signifies a lack of moral restraint and accountability. It suggests that the wicked act as if God's presence and moral scrutiny are absent from their consciousness. This point centers on the significance of reverence for God in moral conduct. He argues that true faith includes a profound reverence for God's moral authority, which serves as a guiding principle for righteous living. The absence of this reverence leads to moral and spiritual decay. Proverbs 1:7. This verse emphasizes that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It underscores the importance of reverence for God as foundational to wisdom and understanding. Psalm 111, verse 10, the psalmist declares, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All those who practice it have a good understanding. This passage reinforces the idea that reverence for God is essential for wisdom and understanding. Proverbs 8:13, another proverb, which states the fear of the Lord is hatred of evil, pride and arrogance in the way of evil, and perverted speech I hate. This verse highlights the reverence for God leads to a hatred of evil. Some real world examples that reinforce Calvin's point would be moral integrity. Individuals who maintain strong moral integrity and ethical behavior often do so because they have a deep reverence for God. They believe that their actions are accountable to a higher moral authority. Decision making. Some people make life decisions based on their reverence for God, seeking guidance and wisdom in their choices by aligning them with their faith and moral principles. Atheism and secularism. In contrast, some atheists and secularists may reject the concept of God and, in so doing, dismiss the idea of moral accountability to the divine being. This worldview can and more often does lead to a lack of moral restraint among some individuals and society as a whole when the culture rejects God and his law. Calvin's eighth point emphasizes the significance of reverence for God in human conduct. In his theological perspective, reverence for God's moral authority is foundational to living a righteous and virtuous life. David's words in the Psalms highlight the absence of this reverence among the wicked, signifying a lack of moral restraint and accountability. Calvin's understanding underscores the importance of faith as a guiding principle for ethical behavior and righteous living. The ninth point Calvin makes is the wicked are described as saying in their hearts that God has forgotten, hidden his face, and will never see their actions. This point is all about the wicked inner thoughts of people. Calvin begins by emphasizing the inner thoughts and attitudes of the wicked. He highlights what they say in their hearts, which signifies their internal beliefs and convictions. The point asserts that the wicked believe that God has forgotten them. This suggests that they think God is no longer mindful of their actions or existence. The wicked also believe that God has hidden his face. In biblical language, this means that they perceive God as being distant or detached from their lives, as if God is not actively observing or involved in their affairs. The wicked hold the belief that God will never see their actions. This implies a denial of God's omniscience, as they think their deeds can go unnoticed by the divine. This point emphasizes the serious misunderstanding of God's nature and attributes displayed by the wicked. Calvin argues that God is both omniscient and omnipresent, and to believe that God has forgotten or is unaware of their actions reflects a profound theological error. Psalm 10, verse 11, he says in his heart, God has forgotten, he has hidden his face, he will never see it. This psalm describes the wicked as saying, "He, that is God, has forgotten, he has hidden his face and will never see it." These words align with the description provided by in Calvin's point. Jeremiah 23, verse 24. The prophet Jeremiah affirms, "Can a man hide himself in secret places so that I cannot see him, declares the Lord? Do I not fill the heaven and the earth, declares the Lord?" This passage underscores God's omnipresence and omniscience. Let's consider some real world examples that align with this perspective. Secrecy and wrongdoing. Some individuals engage in secret or hidden wrongdoing, believing that their actions are concealed from God's view. This reflects the belief that God has hidden his face and is unaware of their actions. Evasion of responsibility. People who evade responsibility for their actions may convince themselves that God has forgotten or is not concerned about their moral choices. Apathy towards divine accountability. Those who live with a disregard for divine accountability may assume that their actions are beyond God's notice or that divine judgment will not apply to them. Calvin's ninth point underscores the profound misunderstanding of God's nature and attributes among the wicked. To believe that God has forgotten, hidden his face, and will never see their actions reflects a theological error concerning God's omniscience and omnipresence. Calvin's perspective reinforces the idea that God is intimately aware of human actions and that divine judgment is a reality, even if some may choose to deny it. This understanding shapes his critique of the wicked who hold such beliefs. On to point 10. Even though they are forced to acknowledge some forms of God, they effectively deny his power by creating a lifeless and mute idol in their minds. Calvin begins by acknowledging that even the wicked are forced, to some extent, to acknowledge the existence of a divine entity or some form of God. This recognition could be due to their innate sense of God or external influences. Despite this acknowledgement, the point asserts that the wicked effectively deny God's power by creating a mental image of God that is lifeless and mute. In other words, they form a conceptual idol in their minds that lacks the attributes and authority associated with the true God. By forming this lifeless and mute idol in their minds, the wicked are denying the true power and attributes of God. Their mental construct falls short of the living and sovereign God depicted in religious teachings. This point emphasizes the contrast between the living God and the lifeless idols created by the wicked in their minds. He argues that true faith involves acknowledging God's living presence and power, while the creation of a mental idol reflects a distorted understanding of God. Isaiah 44, verses 9 through 20. All who fashion idols are nothing, and the things they delight in do not profit. Their witnesses neither see nor know, that they may be put to shame. Who fashions a god or casts an idol that is profitable for nothing? Behold, all his companions shall be put to shame, and the craftsmen are only human. Let them all assemble, let them stand forth. They shall be terrified. They shall be put to shame together. The ironsmith takes a cutting tool and works it over the coals. He fashions it with hammers and works it with his strong arm. He becomes hungry and his strength fails. He drinks no water and is faint. The carpenter stretches a line. He marks it out with a pencil. He shapes it with planes and marks it with a compass. He shapes it into the figure of a man, with the beauty of a man to dwell in his house. He cuts down cedars, or he chooses a cypress tree or an oak and lets it grow strong among the trees of the forest. He plants a cedar and the rains nourish it. Then it becomes fuel for man. He takes part of it and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread. Also, he makes a god and worships it. He makes it an idol and falls down before it. Half of it he burns in the fire. Over the half he eats meat. He roasts it and is satisfied. Also, he warms himself and says, "Aha, I am warm, I have seen the fire." And the rest of it he makes into a god, his idol, and falls down to it and worships it. He prays to it and says, "Deliver me, for you are my God." They know not, nor do they discern, for he has shut their eyes so that they cannot see, and their hearts so that they cannot understand. No one considers, nor is there knowledge or discernment to say, "Half of it I burned in the fire. I also baked on its bread on its coals. I've roasted meat and have eaten. And shall I make the rest of it an abomination? Shall I fall down before a block of wood? He feeds on ashes, a deluded heart has led him astray. He cannot deliver himself, for say, is there not a lie in my right hand? This passage in Isaiah highlights the folly of idolatry and the creation of lifeless idols. It emphasizes the stark contrast between the true God and man made idols. Psalm 115, verses 4 through 8. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak, eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear, noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel, feet but do not walk, and they do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make them become like them. So do all who trust in them. This psalm speaks of idols that have mouths but cannot speak, eyes that cannot see, and so on. It underscores the inherent limitations of idols and their inability to compare with the true God. 1 Corinthians 8:4. Therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence, and that there is no God but one. In the New Testament, Paul discusses the existence of so called gods and the contrast between these idols and the one true God. To illustrate Calvin's point further, we can look to what's going on in the real world. Idol worship. In some cultures, individuals may engage in idol worship, creating and worshiping statues or objects that they believe represent divine entities. These idols are, however, lifeless and mute, lacking the attributes of a living God. Secular worldviews. Some secular worldviews or atheistic perspectives may acknowledge the concept of a higher power or spiritual force, such as a philosophical idea, but envision it as impersonal or devoid of power and the influence in the world. This conceptualization falls short of the living God described in religious traditions. Symbolic spirituality. In certain spiritual or New Age practices, individuals may use symbols, crystals, or other objects as a means of connecting with a higher power or spiritual energy. While these objects hold meaning for practitioners, they are not representative of the living God in traditional religious beliefs. Calvin's 10th point underscores the theological critique of idolatry and the creation of mental idols that fall short of the living and powerful God described in the Christian tradition. He argues that true faith involves acknowledging God's living presence and attributes. In contrast, the creation of a lifeless and mute mental idol reflects a denial of God's true power and authority. This understanding shapes Calvin's critique of those who, while acknowledging some form of divinity, effectively denied the genuine attributes and sovereignty of the one true God. The next point Calvin makes, number 11, the section emphasizes that even though they struggle with their convictions and attempt to banish God entirely, their stupefaction does not prevent them from occasionally facing divine judgment. Calvin begins by highlighting an inner struggle within the hearts and minds of the wicked. These individuals may grapple with their convictions and engage in a deliberate effort to banish God entirely from their thoughts and lives. They actively deny God's presence and moral authority. The term stupefaction refers to a state of mental or moral numbness and dullness. In this context, it suggests that the wicked may attempt to numb their conscience or suppress their innate sense of God. Despite their efforts to banish God and their stupefaction, the point underscores that the wicked are not entirely immune from facing divine judgment. Occasionally, they may encounter the consequences of their actions in a way that reflects divine accountability. This point emphasizes the persistence of divine judgment and the inability of the wicked to fully escape the consequences of their actions. He argues that even when individuals attempt to banish God from their thoughts, divine justice still prevails. Proverbs 15, verse 3. This verse affirms the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. It highlights God's constant awareness and moral oversight. Galatians 6:7. Paul writes, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap." This passage emphasizes the principle of divine retribution. Romans 14:12. Paul reminds believers that each of us will give an account to himself to God. This underscores the idea of individual accountability. Some real life examples that drive home Calvin's point is legal consequences. Individuals who engage in criminal behavior may occasionally face legal consequences, even if they have attempted to evade accountability. This reflects a form of divine judgment through human authorities. Moral awakenings. Some people who have lived in moral indifference or denial of God's moral standards may experience a moral awakening or a conscience pricking, leading them to confront their actions and seek forgiveness or change. Unforeseen circumstances. Unexpected and challenging life events may force individuals to reevaluate their beliefs and actions, acknowledging their vulnerability and dependence upon higher powers. Calvin's 11th point highlights the theological idea that divine judgment remains a constant factor, even in the lives of the wicked who attempt to banish God and numb their consciences. It underscores the principle of divine accountability, where individuals may still face consequences for their actions, ultimately reflecting the persistence of divine justice. This understanding shapes Calvin's critique of those who, despite their efforts to deny God, cannot escape the overarching moral order and accountability inherent in the divine framework. The 12th and final point in this section of the Institutes is, despite occasional confrontations with God's reality, their prevailing state of mind regarding him is described as brutish oblivion. Calvin begins by emphasizing the persistent mental state or mindset of the wicked. This prevailing state of mind is characterized as brutish oblivion. The term brutish suggests a lack of reason or rationality, akin to the behavior of animals. Oblivion indicates a state of forgetfulness or neglect. This point acknowledges that despite their prevailing state of brutish oblivion, the wicked do experience occasional confrontations with God's reality. These confrontations may take the form of life events, moral awakenings, or divine interventions. This point underscores the paradoxical nature of the wicked's mindset. He argues that while they may temporarily acknowledge God's reality during confrontations, their default state remains one of spiritual neglect and irrationality. Psalm 14:4. In the context of Psalm 14, it is mentioned that they have no knowledge. All the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord. This verse highlights the ignorance of the wicked. Ephesians 4:18, Paul describes the Gentiles as darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to their hardness of heart. Proverbs 26:11, like a dog that returns to his vomit is a fool who repeats his folly. This proverb speaks of a fool who repeats his folly, reflecting on the persistence of irrational behavior. Some examples from life that demonstrate the truth of what Calvin is saying would be repetitive behavior. Some individuals may engage in repetitive destructive behavior, despite occasional realizations of its consequences. This default state reflects a lack of rationality or awareness. You can see this in people who claim to have sex addictions. They go out and screw anything and everyone whenever they can and bring misery into their lives through venereal disease or broken relationships or whatever have you. And despite all the misery they bring on themselves through their actions, they go out and do it again and again and again. And it's just like a complete lack of awareness that their actions are destroying them. They just prefer their temporary pleasure to the long term satisfaction and pleasure that comes from a virtuous life. Spiritual apathy. People who intermittently attend religious services or engage in spiritual practices but live predominantly secular lives may experience moments of spiritual confrontation, yet their prevailing state is one of spiritual apathy or neglect. And moral recklessness. Individuals who occasionally face moral dilemmas or ethical confrontations may revert to morally reckless behavior once the intermittent challenge is resolved, indicating a lack of sustained moral awareness. Calvin's 12th point underscores the paradoxical nature of the wicked's mindset. Despite occasional confrontations with God's reality, their prevailing state of brutish oblivion reflects a lack of rationality and spiritual neglect. It highlights the tension between moments of awareness and a default state of spiritual indifference, informing Calvin's critique of those who oscillate between brief acknowledgments of God and persistently irrational and neglectful mindsets. In Calvin's Institutes, a wisdom unfolds. 12 verses of truth, let the story be told. From Psalms to our lives, his insights take flight. In each verse, a lesson, in each line, a light. Fool David penned in his heart doth claim, there is no God. They declare in their reckless game, yet deep in their hearts his presence they feel, a truth in their conscience, a glimmer so real. The wicked may try to stifle the light, denying God's presence with all of their might. But deep down inside, a truth they must face, a God shaped void is in their spiritual space. In the depths of their sin, they seek to forget their natural sense of God, they'd rather omit. Yet, despite their attempts, God's judgment they'll see, for divine accountability waits patiently. With madness, they claim God's justice has ceased, an idle observer in heavenly peace. But this vision distorted their actions belie, for God's governance reigns both just and most high. God's nature they miss in their reckless advance, casting off his governance, leaving things to chance. But nothing is less to the nature of God than allowing evil to flourish unmarred and unshod. In security they revel, denying God's gaze, thinking divine judgment they can simply erase. Yet their denial can't shield them from fate, for divine retribution they cannot abate. Divine punishment comes, hearts dulled by their sin, closing their eyes, their view from within. Yet God's justice prevails, though they fail to see a lesson in blindness in their moral decree. A lack of God's reverence they choose to embrace, a God they acknowledge but still can't efface. But in their mental idols, lifeless and mute, they deny God's true power in their resolute pursuit. God's presence they question, his face they conceal, believing their actions will never be revealed. But divine omniscience knows every stride. Their denial won't alter what God does decide. Though they struggle and strive to escape their own fate, their stupefaction won't save them from God's weight. Confronted at times by divine reality, their prevailing state stays in brutish frivolity. In their hearts, they grapple with God's presence and might, but their prevailing state remains ever in flight. For even though they try to banish God's view, divine judgment will find them, their reckoning is due. With brutish oblivion, they wander astray, yet moments of clarity do come their way. But in their default state, they drift and they roam. In Calvin's Institute, God's wisdom finds a home. Until next time, continue to follow Jesus, who is the way. Like, subscribe, share, comment, pray for me, all that good stuff. See you next time.